Welcome everyone to session 12 of our study of the Gospel of Mark. We are motoring through and kind of hitting we only have about 4 or 5 more sessions together for this gospel. So today I've been looking forward to today's class in a lot of ways since we covered the parable of the sower. Because, let's put it this way. Mark as a gospel can be divided into 2 major divisions, okay? The first division is roughly the first 10 chapters, and that is characterized by Jesus' healing and teaching ministry, okay? And it's also characterized by a foundational parable called the parable of the sower. And in that parable, we see this spreader of the seed, which is Jesus, and the seed is the word, throwing the seed on all types of soils with what we can call uneven results. And in many ways, that parable is sort of a summary of what that whole first division is about. It's about the different ways that the soil reacts to getting the seed, and sometimes it's fruitful, and most times it's not. Okay, so that parable of the sower is sort of that summary of that first division. Well, we have a second division in the Gospel of Mark that we just hit, really starting with chapter 11 and all the way through to the end, chapter 16, verse 8. And in that second division, what we see is Jesus stepping into his more sort of public ministry, or his public identity as the Messiah King, and more than that, even as a religious leader, as sort of like a scribe priest type role as well. And so he steps into that role also with uneven results, and there's a foundational parable for this division too, and that is what we're reading today, and it's called the parable of the tenants. And what's so powerful about this parable is, again, it's sort of a summary of what the rest of the gospel will be, but it really illustrates the way that Jesus sort of steps into his identity as being an heir of the vineyard. And unfortunately, the way the parable tells us is that the heir sort of steps in, and it sort of it portends the death of the heir of the vineyard that we see. So it's a very powerful parable it's worthy of deep attention. And then the rest of the chapter today really picks up on a lot of the sort of the themes that are introduced. But I want to pick up on a couple things before I let you all get into some of your reflections and questions. And that is, the parable itself really emphasizes this idea of what it means to be an heir, and this connection to an inheritance. And it begs of us to reflect on what is it that it used to mean to consider Jesus being an heir to something, and what was the inheritance that everyone expected him to step into. And then what is this parable trying to tell us about what it means to be an heir? And not just this parable, but the rest of the gospel. How is that shaping what it means to say that Jesus is the heir, and what really is his inheritance? It might be quite different than what we've thought, and certainly what most of the characters have expected throughout the gospel to this point. But don't worry, we'll get to see what it is. So any opening comments or reflections from you on this week's reading, or anything we've read up to this point? I'm sorry, you must all be talking at once. I'll have to, adjust my volume here. All right, well, hey, no problem. We're going to get into all of this. There's a lot to take in here, but we'll take it step by step. So I would love if there aren't any questions or comments before we get in, could I have 4 volunteers to help with our reading? And then if any other questions come up, then we can address those. Okay, Bonnie and Barbara. And Marilyn. And Sue. Okay. Awesome. Okay, no questions or comments.
It just seems like such a familiar story.
Oh, I know. You mean the parable of the talents, or sort of some of the other ones
Well,
too?
both of them. And so I'm anxious
Not
to
the talent,
hear new insight.
yes. Yeah, well, that's true. And I think that's often the case. And you can expect that. I hope you've come to expect that when we are in our familiarity zone, it's often the best move to kind of take that step back, remove the clothing of previous interpretation, and really try to look at it fresh. And hopefully we'll get to do that today. Okay, then let's, Horty, yes.
Whenever I read this, I recall the feeling that I had as a child the first time I read it, and going, no, 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 and really having a gut-wrenching response to this story as a child.
Beautiful. And I can tell you that visceral gut human response is exactly what Mark is wanting us as an audience to perceive. The way he writes it, as you will see, it just sort of ratchets it up. And from our perspective, it's almost unbelievable that this is going to happen on a couple different levels. It's unbelievable that they would kill him. And in some ways, check within yourself. Is it unbelievable that God even sends him? That sort of thing. I'm sorry, God, the Lord of the vineyard. Is it unbelievable that the Lord of the vineyard would even do that based on what's happened previously? So we'll look at that. But for sure, it leads us to like react, and this is the gospel. This is what the gospel is supposed to be doing. If we're not reacting to this stuff, if we're not finding ourselves talking out loud even to the story or to ourselves, then Mark has, it's just not achieving what he's hoping. So. Okay, let's jump in to the reading. Where's the share screen here? Here we go. Okay, Bonnie, could you start and just read the whole parable of the wicked tenants, please?
Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a pit for the winepress, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants to collect from them his share of the produce of the vineyard. But they seized him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another slave to them. This one they beat over the head and insulted. Then he sent another, and that one they killed. And so it was with many others. Some they beat, and others they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those tenants said one to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. When they realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away.
Thank you. Next, Barbara, would you please read the next two sections, starting with the question about paying taxes?
The question about paying taxes. Then they sent him to some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then he said to them, Whose head is this and whose title? They answered, the emperor's. Jesus said to them, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were utterly amazed at him. The question about the resurrection. Some Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to him and asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man dies, leaving a wife but no child, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. There were 7 brothers. The first married, and when he died, left no children. And the second married the widow and died, leaving no children. And the third likewise. None of the 7 left children. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, is not this the reason you are wrong, that you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the story about the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong.
Thank you. Marilyn, would you please read the next 2 sections, starting with the first commandment?
Okay. The first commandment. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Then the scribe said to him, you are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. After that, no one dared to ask him any question. The question about David's son. While Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how can he be his son? And the large crowd was listening to him with delight.
Thank you. And lastly, Sue, would you please take us home?
Jesus denounces the scribes. As he taught, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. The widow's offering. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on.
Thank you. Okay, so a lot of familiar passages, a lot of rich stories there. You might sense some increasing resistance and opposition to Jesus, some real intensification here, and him kind of stepping into, again, as we've been saying, kind of stepping into his identity in a new, more public way than he had done previously. But I want to ask you, so that initial 12 verses, the parable of the tenants, it has both a function in terms of within the narrative or within the story of what it does, but then also sort of theologically, what is it telling us about this one that comes in Jesus? Well, it doesn't take much to understand that the heir that they're talking about, the son that is talked about, is Jesus. So what does it mean in terms of the story? What is the point of the parable of the tenants in terms of the story so far that we've heard in Mark's gospel? And part of it is remembering back to last week, a question that was asked of Jesus that he never actually got to answer yet. Bonnie, did you have your hand up, or did you want to say something else? It doesn't matter if it relates to what I just said.
No, it reminded me of the parable of the sower, where if it was just being thrown on rocky soil, sort of like he was sending a messenger and he kept sending the messenger and they kept rejecting and even killed people, but they weren't getting the message and they didn't want to. They were just turning a deaf ear. And then, of course, the worst happened. And so then the last line, I think, was, well, he will give it to some other tenants then. And after I guess you can only go so far to keep, sending the message to people that just are not interested and just refuse to listen. And then you move on to, hopefully some more, some soil that is more receptive.
Beautiful. That's exactly what it's trying to say. It's about more fruitful soil. And as you read the parable, pay attention to what is happening. There's this initial list of all of these servants or slaves. The word is the same in Greek, but in my translation, it called them slaves, that were sent as emissaries of the Lord of the vineyard. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to harvest the fruit. They're trying to get the fruit. That's what the whole gospel has been about so far, is trying to pull the fruit, or to cultivate the fruit and have it be harvested, in the world, in life, through faith. And progressively, the response to these slaves is negative. They're beaten, they're killed. They don't, the people that come, some scholars have looked at this parable and said, oh, do these refer to specific prophets, in the history? And not really. They're sort of meant to be more general. I mean, you'll see in some of those that some of the things that they describe happening, that's kind of what happened to John the Baptist. He was killed. He was hit in the head, I guess, but it's not intended to be sort of a literal one-to-one correspondence to any specific prophets, but referencing that throughout the tradition of prophets, of those who have been sent to be emissaries of the faith and of God, the response has more often than not been to be rejected. And so in this case, Jesus, or the Son, is sent, and his reception, or his death, precipitates something else. And that is, what shall the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come to destroy those tenants, to remove them and to replace them. And we'll get into what that means. But in the story, what this parable is doing is it's basically responding to the question that they asked him last chapter. And that was, remember, and they've asked him many times, but most recently, just a few verses ago, with the, it might have been the fig tree, related to the fig tree story, but it was the scribes and the Pharisees going, where does he get the authority to do this? Well, this parable is telling exactly where he gets the authority to do this. And it shows that Jesus brings with him a mastery of this greater realm, because he is the heir of the vineyard. Okay? He is the heir of the vineyard. So he has a mastery that he's been granted, that he demonstrates, and then others react to the mastery that he has. And that's exactly what we'll see in this chapter. So then theologically, what is this what is this parable trying to say about who Jesus is? Theologically, when I know that it might be like, well, what is that? What does he mean by theologically? On a deeper level, what is this parable trying to convey about what kind of heir Jesus is? Marilyn and then Barbara?
That he's the Son of God.
Yes. And what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the inheritance that he has? Barbara?
Well, I think in terms of the times, he's the promised Messiah, but he's not the kind of Messiah they're looking for.
Yeah. It's like they were expecting. So he is the Son of God, and so that's alluding to it. They were expecting this Messiah King, and he's certainly stepping into that role. That's what the whole triumphal entry was about. All that stuff, all the laying of the branches and the cloaks and the riding of the donkey, that's king imagery. That's deliberate sort of claiming of that aspect of his role. But as this parable is saying, he is not just an heir of David. He is an heir of the whole darn vineyard.
Yeah.
He's much more than that Davidic king. And so as we have seen, and as we will see again in this chapter, his realm of mastery is not just the military and political, but it's the religious, it's the cultic, it's the law, areas of law. He displays mastery. As the heir of the vineyard, he displays his mastery and then evokes various responses based on what he is saying and doing. Okay. Questions or comments about that or anything else about the parable of the tenants? So one of the main theological questions that is very important to see here, because in our church upbringing, we receive lots of different messages about this particular thing. But the simple question is, based on what the parable of the tenants is telling us, does the vineyard owner send the son expecting him to die? I'm seeing people nodding and I'm seeing people shake their heads. Horty?
No, absolutely not. He expects him to be respected and to be able to gather into the fruit that is due him.
That's right. A lot of us have this idea that Jesus was sent as a way of covering the sins of humanity. You know, that idea of the ransom, and a ransom is still right in terms of that's what Mark says he is, but it's a willing ransom. It's a willing stepping in. It's not God sending him to die on behalf of humanity. But you will notice, maybe within your own upbringing or maybe within other conversations you have or other churches you might go to, that oftentimes that is presented quite differently. Well, different gospels have different things to say about it. But in Mark's gospel, it is very clearly a foolish love that the owner of the vineyard, that the Lord of the vineyard demonstrates when he sends the son. After all those people are killed and beaten and not received at all, he has this foolish idea that, oh, they'll respect my son. They'll listen to him. And then we see what happens as a result of that. So what it teaches us is that the levels of compassion that this Lord of the vineyard has goes far beyond human understanding, human reasoning. Because I think as maybe Horty was indicating and others of you felt as you were reading that parable, it's like, you're almost like, oh my God, no, don't, I can't believe, no, why are you doing that? You know, why are you killing them? Why, as you know, talking to the tenants, but oh my gosh, why would the Lord send his son? It's just, he's just gonna, it's like, you know, slaughter. It's like a lamb to the slaughter kind of thing. Well, what that is it's a way of saying that it wasn't it wasn't a prefigured understanding, but because of the lack of reception, because of the evil nature of those of the tenants, that's why the son died. And I want to be very clear. The death of the son in the parable precipitates the coming of the Lord. So in this case, God, the return of God to act on behalf and to clear out the tenants. The clearing is not a rejection of all the tenants. It's a rejection of those in power. And even the next line says so, because he's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're like, oh, that was about us. See, sometimes, again, in our upbringing or our appreciation of these stories, we can almost get a little bit too broad brushed and say, oh, well, that was the rejection of the Jews. They had their chance and they blew it. So now it's on to the Gentiles and other things. Well, the door is open to include Gentiles, because it's not about your ethnicity, as we've seen. It's about your heart, your faith, your response. But in this case, the replacement of the tenants has to do with those who were hardened of heart, who were the poor soil, that were incapable of receiving the seed or the word and engendering real faith and creating real fruit. That lack of fruitfulness is what needs to be replaced, and what the Lord of the vineyard will replace. Questions or comments about any of that? Bonnie?
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
So let's say that the intent of God to send Jesus to the earth, to send his son, was not to have him sacrificed for the sins of the world, which is,
Correct.
what a lot of us were taught, or at least what I was taught.
Correct.
So if that was not the intent, what other purpose would there be? Send him like the Lord of the vineyard and just think people were going to, God would know whether people were going to listen or not listen. But I mean, that's that whole omnipotent, all that. But I guess this is such an ingrained story about how Christ came and he died for the sins of the world, and you believe on him, et cetera, that it doesn't leave any other option, that, maybe there could have been some other path besides being killed, but I don't know what that would be, because that's what it was. I don't know.
I think that's what it's trying to say. And you're bringing up so many great points, because I think you're naming what a lot of us, if not directly from our upbringing or our awareness, but we have a sense that that's out there, those ideas. And the fact is, we tend to conflate a lot of this stuff. The fact that Jesus can be sent as a ransom, as a willing ransom, is different than saying he was sent as a necessary sacrifice, that God intended that. That is not what Mark is saying. And so we have to allow ourselves to step back and then see, what is Mark trying to say? Because he's saying a lot here in this chapter, and he kind of responds to what you're referring to. He gets into some of it as to what it all means. But what this parable is telling us is that it is the death of the son that precipitates this response by the Lord of the vineyard. Now, he doesn't say it's going to happen right now. He doesn't say when that's going to happen, but the Lord of the vineyard will come and clear out the fruitless, faithless, hardened of heart tenants. That's what's going to happen. There are consequences to that, but it's the Lord coming back. Okay, the owner of the vineyard, so to speak. So it's setting us up for a different understanding than what a lot of us have received, because of the way we have all these different messages, the different gospels in the through tradition, because that's what churches have long done. We've conflated the story. That's why we have the Christmas pageant the way we do. We just throw them all together in one hodgepodge. It's still beautiful. It still conveys something of truth, but we start to forget that this is they're used for totally different purposes in their original contexts. So this Markan perspective on the passion and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus is very specific, and why this happens is different than, say, Luke and Matthew. and certainly John. But it can be hard for us. So that's why it's important to sort of say, all right, let's identify that what Mark's talking about here is different than what other gospels talk about. And let's do our best to take off the cloaks of previous understanding and interpretation and see where Mark is trying to take us and what then is his ultimate point. What is the ultimate concern? And Bonnie, the fact that that's a question is great, because Mark's okay with that. He will help us understand what he means by this. So it's good that we can kind of approach it with this. What's he getting at? What's he talking about? I think we have some idea based on what he's shown us, but we've still got 4 or 5 chapters left to kind of get into it, and he will help explain it to us. Other questions or comments? Peter.
I love this idea of foolish love. To be able to love mankind, to love each of us, regardless of what we harbor or think or are, is foolish by human standards. And it reminds me of the story of Job in a way, where I thought God acted foolishly there by saying to Satan, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, try to tempt my servant Job. Job is untemptable. Job is, he loved him with a foolish love. And so Satan, he did not feel threatened that Satan could harm Job. I'd be interested in your comment about that.
Okay, well, first of all, certainly the idea of a foolish love is what is necessary, in that faith in the Gospel of Mark, and I think in just our way of understanding it in general, is not something that we come to out of sort of a rationalized, kind of by human standards of reasoning and laying it all out there and being convinced like a jury in a court or something like that. But faith is a willingness to step out of the areas of our comfort zone or the areas of our empowerment or disempowerment or all the different things that might seek to throw us aside, keep us down, keep us from discovering that seed of possibility within us that Jesus is able to see in every instance here. Because the seeds of possibility are not just for those who are sick, they are more able to see it more readily. That's partly why they have that's why their soil is receptive. But there are examples throughout the gospel of those who come from those categories of hardness of heart that still are capable of enacting that foolish love that we've seen. And foolish love in this instance, of the tenants is different than the foolish love of someone like Jairus who rushes out and just throws himself at Jesus because he's desperate for his daughter to be healed, that sort of thing. But it's all about faith. What motivates faith is sort of a release of those often cognitive, the ways we try to make our decisions from up here and move into a different space from which we react in the world. And I think that is something that is timeless. That is something that has remained a challenge for us in terms of our day-to-day living and following. And this whole gospel is laying that before us in such a powerful way of showing that, the act of faith isn't going to be something that we can figure out and make a formula or a recipe for. It's something where we have to kind of step out of those places and take a leap. And that's what the people who find healing have done, who find wholeness, who produce fruit. As far as Job goes, that is a multi-layered presentation of an ancient kind of myth that has been brought together with many other kind of explanations and understandings of the nature of human existence and human suffering. And so in that sense, it's hard sometimes to determine to what degree the character of Job is meant to be an everyman or is meant to be a sort of a specific individual of faith. So that's so in some ways he does embody those qualities of being sort of just continuing to hang in there with God, even though life is collapsing all around him. That embodies that foolish hope. But I don't necessarily think that it's only about that he is also used as a means of talking about, the way people in general in that world understood God and understood suffering and understood, the role of humanity in it, because when his friends come up and they try to explain different things, they're speaking the wisdom of the world. And the book of Job is trying to really get underneath that and help break that wide open. And certainly the resolution of the book of Job breaks that wide open too. But in general, the approach to faith is one that is measured much more by our willingness to foolishly leap from that heart space than it is anything we can determine or discern or sort of verify through our cognitive or through our brain function.
No, not yet.
That was a lot of words.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Dan.
I'm not getting the last portion of that parable. I understand he sent the heir,
Yep.
but I don't see that God is getting rid of the hard-hearted. Now, the followers of Muhammad are trying, but I don't see Christians throwing out the hard-hearted here.
Okay. I don't know that it's talking about specific, sort of the way you're applying it, but think about within the context of the gospel. And we've seen the various people responding to Jesus, and we've seen how it's, he's already made reference to the fact that there are certain types of soil that can be receptive and certain types of soil that might be receptive, but certain types of soil that just aren't. And so this parable is illustrating the fact that when God sends the son, or the owner of the vineyard, the Lord of the vineyard sends the son, and he is rejected and killed, that then precipitates the return of the Lord of the vineyard, in this case, God, to remove those tenants who were so hard-hearted, who were so incapable of being fruitful that they killed the son, the emissary. Okay. In this case, that group of people are the religious leaders who have been constant opposition to Jesus in the context of this story, who have been nothing except monolithically opposed to him. And since chapter 3, verse 6, have been finding any way they can to plot against him so that he might be killed. So Mark has long set up this dynamic, and this parable is illustrating that there's a point where that type of response will have consequences. And so the son will die. I mean, Jesus has been talking about that for 3 different times now, three different predictions that this will happen. So this isn't surprising, but that's really all it's sort of trying to talk about. It's not necessarily to be applied in direct ways, I think, the way you were talking as far as within Christianity or within Islam or that, but it's more about that response to Jesus that represents that hardness of heart, that impenetrable soil, that lack of faith that leads to nothing but rejection. It leads to the seed not being able to get in. And more than that, it leads to plots for harm and for ultimately death for the son. And that then creates this whole response. Again, that Mark doesn't specify when it'll happen, but the Lord's coming back, he says. And that's a motif that is very common in the apocalyptic literature, this idea of the return. But oftentimes that second coming image is one of the son returning. Mark's image here is very much the Lord returning. Okay. Now, there's a lot of ways that the later writers, they bring those two together. But that's, in Mark's case, there's a distinction between the son and the Lord of the vineyard returning. But one way or another, the death of the heir death of the heir of the vineyard, the son, precipitates this impending shifting of power within the tenants of the vineyard. Because what the Lord wants of the vineyard, all the Lord of the vineyard wants is fruitful production. And that's why all those prophets were sent to kind of claim the fruit for the sake of the owner of the vineyard. But there's so much resistance to that. And ultimately, where there's no fruit, the kingdom of God cannot thrive. So that's what's this, like a cleansing time. But it's not a destruction of the vineyard. Notice that. It's not a destruction of the vineyard. It's a replacement of the tenants who were the ones that killed the son. Okay, and in that case, it's not all Jews. It's those in power, or those who had the religious power. That's who's characterized, at least in this. Now we have to be careful about how we apply this, admittedly, because we can go way too broad stroked with it. But that's what the parable is bringing up and presenting at this point. And we'll see then how that plays out in Mark's gospel with the rest of the stories.
Yeah, but Dan, the scribes won. They're still there after 2,000 years.
The
They're
scribes
still
won?
in power.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know that that's what, yeah, I will say this. Mark is not concerned about what happens, 2,000 years. He's concerned about what happens to the person reading or experiencing that gospel. This is a very present tense gospel. That's how it's written. Everything's about the present tense. Everything is about, doesn't matter what the rest of the world's doing. Where are you? And if he's not engaging us to enter the text like that, then he's failed as a crafter of a gospel. Again, a gospel is an argument. He's trying to pull us in and say, what kind of soil are you? Because that's really what the kingdom of God relies on. It's not going to be broad stroke sweeps of military victory from outside of us. That's not how it works. It's about a decision from within. And we've seen that so far, and we'll continue to see how that's played out. So ultimately, you might look at it from a historical vantage point, Dan, and say, well, this group won and they didn't win. That may or may not be true. But what has it done within each one of us? What kind of soil am I? Ultimately, that is where the creation of the kingdom of God emanates. Okay, ultimately, for Mark, that's where it comes from. Now, he refers to the fact that this Lord of the vineyard will come in the future, but he doesn't specify what that, when, at least at this point. Marilyn, and then Horty.
Yeah, I am taking this very personally, because I think for a whole bunch of years I was rocky soil. Some of you know my story. For 40 years, I only went to church maybe once or twice a year, and I certainly didn't belong to any church. And I was exploring Buddhism, and I was exploring Taoism and other kinds of religions, and I gained a tremendous amount from that. But something was lacking. And for me, it was the whole spiritual, the whole God is within me, all that kind of thing that wasn't there with Buddhism and Taoism, but for me is there for Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so now, when we aren't having a pandemic, I go to church every Sunday. I come to Bible study over Zoom. I think I've become much more fertile soil. But I just find it more meaningful myself to be applying this to me.
Yeah. And none of us can really know, it's not a settled thing, us being fertile soil or not. But I think an awareness of the fact that we embody all the different types of soil helps shape us to move into those practices and directions that nourish the bearing of fruit. It gives us an opportunity, because it's not about we're there, and we just, okay, I've arrived, I'm there, I know where I'm headed, that kind of thing. As soon as we start talking like that, I think we've missed it. That's really what the disciples do throughout. They're like, oh, we're there, we're right, we got the right hand side, we got the left hand side, we're in the glory with you, right? This is where, and they're missing it the whole time. But it's more about this humble approach of serving neighbor, of serving God with compassion that knows no bounds. There's something there about that's what the bearing of the fruit looks like. And Dan, I know I'm going to you, Horty, but I wanted to follow up one more thing. When Mark was written, the context was the audience was already aware that the temple had been destroyed by the war with Rome from 66 to 70. So in a sense, the temple structure, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all those rulers were gone in the way that they were known. So in a sense, they had been cleansed by the awareness of the context of that time. Yeah, as you say, maybe down the road, we have a different appreciation. But I think when you kind of keep it in where Mark's audience would have seen, they would have seen, oh my gosh, we've seen how it's been collapsed. So maybe this is what Mark's doing here. Maybe that whole war we had with Rome was the means of the Lord sort of cleansing the ways we do things and giving us an opportunity to take a new direction, that sort of thing. Now, there's a lot that we can talk about in that, but I think the whole point of Mark's gospel is to try to make sense of what has been happening in their world. And how could it be that this Messiah we expected to come save us is dead, and now our temple's gone? What's the story here? Okay, it's not easy to present this, but as we're seeing, Mark is doing an incredibly powerful job at teaching us that ultimate victory has nothing to do with military victory in a narrow time frame, but victory in terms of the victory of compassion, of unyielding love, of humble serving, of faith. Those are where the fruits of the soil will thrive. Horty?
Sort of on a 90-degree turn from exactly what we're talking about. I'm struck in this parable by the fact that the tenants were given custody, not ownership, but custody of the vineyard. And that really all the owner wanted was his fair share. He just wanted a portion of their fruit. He wasn't asking for a total sacrifice. He wasn't coming to take the vineyard. He just said, I want essentially what's my portion, my part. The deal was made. And they were so stingy, they wouldn't even give him a part of what they've been given custody of.
Well, I think what you're bringing up, actually, it wasn't just that they're stingy, it's that they misunderstood what being an heir meant. Because that idea that we have of being an heir or an inheritance is, oh, we get the money and the property of those who die before us. That's our common worldly understanding of inheritance. But the inheritance that the parable of the tenants is talking about is not an inheritance that is just like that you own this. But no, it's an inheritance of receiving a way of being in the world. And that's the difference. So they weren't just stingy, they completely misunderstood what an inheritance even means in this parable, those tenants that did that. So that's the nature of their wickedness. They think that that being heirs means they receive the mantle and they get to be and rule over others and that sort of thing. All the stuff that the Gospel of Mark thus far has talked about are the ways of exactly missing it, of exactly missing the point of what Jesus is talking about.
And I was struck by the fact that they're not even related. So if they kill the son, they're not related. What makes them think they're going to get the inheritance in the first place?
Well, because their whole idea of inheritance is that they think that if they kill him, that it'll just fall to them because they think it's this idea of ownership, that it's their thing to have. But what Jesus is conveying and what the Gospel of Mark has told us so far, that it's a way of being. It's not something you have. You don't hold on to it like this. And so their attitude, their whole impression of what it is just wrong from the start. So their inability to receive the message that Jesus has been saying the whole time is the reason why they reject him and ultimately kill him. So that's a setup. That parable, again, Mark is going to continue to build off that parable and give us examples of how, those with who encounter Jesus, how they respond to him, and what it is that is, pushing their buttons and causing them, because that parable is kind of telling us what we already know, and that is that ultimately this one will be rejected and killed. And so it's going to be this tightening that we see of all these encounters and this ratcheting up of intensity. And so right after this parable, we have this trap that is set for Jesus, okay, by the Pharisees and the Herodians, with the whole paying taxes to Caesar. And so what was the trap that they were trying to lay for him? With the taxes thing. Yeah. Boyce, I'll go with Boyce. I hadn't heard Boyce yet.
Lucky you. I've forgotten what I was going to say. Move on.
Okay. Bob, that's all right. If you think of it, come back.
If Jesus says not to give the taxes to Caesar, it gets him in trouble.
Well, yeah. Put it this way. If he says to pay taxes, that's going to get him in trouble with the people, because nobody likes paying taxes. The Pharisees and the Herodians like that. But if he says not to pay taxes, that'll get him in trouble with Rome, who are very much interested in people paying taxes. So the Pharisees and the Herodians like that. So they have set him up with what they think is just the perfect setup, the perfect trap. So how does Jesus wriggle out of it? I love that word wriggle, by the way. It's just, I wrote that a couple times and it's just such a fun word, wriggle. How does he wriggle out of it? Bob?
Give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's.
Inherently, he's making a point here. By lifting up that coin, he's showing them, all right, see whose image that is? That's Caesar. So give Caesar all that stuff with his image on it. But you know whose image is imprinted on you? All you got to go is back to your Torah, your Genesis. All of us have been imprinted with the image of God. So give that stuff to God. He is showing a mastery here. And what's brilliant about this, we know it's brilliant because we just see it. And that's why these stories are so timeless. But what he's saying here, he's demonstrating this mastery over the proper relationship of religion to state. He is showing that he is a much more accomplished lawyer than the lawyers who would seek to trap him. Okay, he's a better lawyer than all those lawyers. And again, he's stepping into the fullness of his mastery, of his inheritance. He's not just the heir of David. He's not just some military political king, but no, he has religious authority. He has cultic authority. He has social authority. And that's what these stories are all going to illustrate. So basically, he turns it on them, these lawyers and Pharisees and Herodians that would seek to trip him up, and he shows them his mastery over them and their understanding, okay? So he just basically knocks that one off. Next up. See how it's set up here? It's like we just did these different groups that just kind of keep coming at him. There's 3 controversies that happen. That's the first one. The next one's the Sadducees. What are they trying to do? The Sadducees are the one with the 7 brothers and no kids. And where are they going to meet and who's going to be married in heaven? Why are they coming at him with this? 40?
Because they specifically do not believe in resurrection.
That's right. Sadducees think the idea of resurrection is ridiculous. And so they want to set up a ridiculous example to make Jesus look foolish. How's that work out? It doesn't work out so well for them.
Jesus says there's no relevance.
Yeah, I love how he does it too. It's just so wonderful the way he does it. And it's sort of subtle what he does, but I mean, I think he gives us enough information. But before we go into what Jesus does with the Sadducees here, I want to make sure that we're thinking of, as we hit this story, we're thinking of all the ways that the Gospel of Mark has already provided support for the idea of resurrection. What things can you think of that we've already seen or heard that illustrate Mark's support for the idea and the reality of resurrection? I'm not saying that that resurrection is this specific thing, but the idea of it is real. What have we seen? Horty?
He's raised several people from the dead.
Yeah. So Jairus's daughter, for instance, that's a big one. We've seen that. What else? What else have we seen? What other stories? What other what things have we heard? It's important to have some of these in mind because it really relates to how Jesus responds here. We've had Jesus make 3 predictions of his passion and resurrection. So he's referred to the idea. Remember back to this. How many times when they were saying, who is this Jesus? And Herod says something like, well, he must be John the Baptist raised. The disciples, when Jesus says, who do the people say that I am? What do the disciples say? Well, some say you're John the Baptist, or some say you're Elijah raised. What's the transfiguration show us? This present reality of Moses and Elijah, long since gone, but talking with Jesus in the present. It's this powerful expression of support for this idea that resurrection is real. Okay? And so when Jesus then goes into it with the Sadducees, what is he saying to them? How does, when he says, so you're wrong, why are they wrong? Why are they wrong in their understanding of the scripture and the tradition? Carol?
It's not the pairing up, it's not earth going up and resurrected as it was here. It's a whole new world, and it's nothing like what we have here.
Well, it may or may not be nothing like what we have here, but there's a tense. There's a tense to our relationship with God that never changes. In what tense do we relate to God? I'm sorry that if that's a little confusing, but
Present tense.
Yes. We always relate to God in the present tense. When Jesus talks about, remember that burning bush story? When God talks to Moses and says, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he is saying the relationship between all of these ancestors and God is always present tense. So there is no past. So there is the resurrection is real because we are always with God. We are always present. We are always made alive, as Carol's saying, in a new way, in a different, and he sort of refers to that, but he doesn't get so specific about that because what he's really referring to is it's a matter of tense. We are always in the present when it comes to God. So your whole idea about this being, this nonsense that you're bringing up, it's irrelevant. That's what Jesus is saying to them. It's irrelevant because we are all in the present when it comes to God. We are all in that means of relationship. So when we die physically, we will still be with God. That's resurrection. Questions or comments? In that moment, Jesus is being a better priest than the priests. He's showing them his mastery of understanding their own tradition. The Sadducees had a very specific attitude. Pharisees believed in resurrection. There were a number of Jewish leadership that believed in the idea of resurrection. Sadducees famously did not. And the old joke is that's why they're sad, you see. But it's terrible, and I hate saying that one, but I basically say it every time I mention the Sadducees, so you're welcome. But
thank you, Dan.
You're welcome, Anne. I'm glad. But this is the intent of this interaction with the Sadducees is basically for Jesus to illustrate, not just to them, but to the audience, that his realm of inheritance, him being an heir, is far more than David, far more than Mr. Military and political king. His realm is the universal realm of the religion and the practices and the relationship of religion to social and to state and all that. See, it's much broader. And that's what Mark is giving us. He's helping us to appreciate what the inheritance that this son is stepping into really looks like. It's fullness. And as Jesus demonstrates his mastery, it sort of silences the critics, but you can see that it creates much more tension because they feel much more threatened by him. Not everyone, but in general, that level of threat increases so that we get ultimately the response that we see. So then the question remains, for Mark, is Jesus' resurrection a unique event? And this is another very important theological concept. Is it a unique event for Jesus to be resurrected? It's not. It's not. Resurrection is part of a long-standing practice of present tense relationship with God. That's the long-standing practice. Now, we have different ideas as to what resurrection means, but they're not coming from Mark. Because Mark's understanding of resurrection is that it's not unique to Jesus. He's participating in something that happened at least as far back as Abraham and through all those ancestors. It happened that far back. It happened in the story of his ministry with Jairus' daughter and others. And it will happen with him as he said so. Because it just always happens. Because it's not about past, present, future. It's just about this is what is. And so this is what's important to recognize. For the Gospel of Mark, it is Jesus' death as that final messenger, as that son, which provokes, the coming of the Lord of the vineyard. It's Jesus' death that is what makes Jesus distinctive and vitally important, not his resurrection. His resurrection is assumed, it's assured, because we are all living in the present tense with God all the time. But it is not the thing that is the deep focus on the gospel. It's part of what is real, but it is the death of the heir that precipitates the action that is to come of God. And when you look at the way Mark finishes, it makes sense. Mark's gospel finishes with a statement of resurrection in an empty tomb. No glorious post-resurrection appearances like in Matthew or in Luke, but just this statement. Because there's something else that Mark is focused on. Again, it's not to downplay resurrection, but it is not unique to Jesus, and it is not that thing which the whole gospel is oriented around. It's assured, it's assumed, it's understood, but it is not the sole focus. I would argue that's not the focus. How's that land? Yeah, it's a lot to take in. I get it. And again, it's not to threaten ideas that we have had of resurrection and the singularity of Jesus in resurrection, but from Mark's perspective, resurrection is not unique to Jesus. And so as we take that in, just do the best you can to allow Mark's way of rendering this to just sort of sink in itself, not comparing it to some of those others, so that we can continue to go where he's taking us and see what it's asking of us. What is Mark's ultimate concern then, if it's not so much focused on resurrection? Now, resurrection is vitally important, but it's not the be all end all. Again, it's not unique to Jesus. It's what happens because we are all living in the present with God. So Mark's argument may be that whether we live or whether we die, we belong to God. That's sort of what Paul says. And so stop focusing on this waiting to be fruitful in the next life. Maybe that's part of what he's saying. I don't want to go into too much speculation about it because that's up to each one of us to determine what is Mark's ultimate focus. But this is what he's leading to. This is what he's opening up for us. Resurrection is very real. The idea of resurrection is supported in the Gospel of Mark, but there are other things. There are other things that are more, that are what make Jesus unique and vitally important for the message of God's kingdom. Boys?
To me, resurrection happens in different ways. I was raised that after you die and you go to a place where you get to talk to God and talk to Jesus, and we would all look the same, and you'd get to see your parents, grandparents, and everybody's together.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what we're doing right now is a form of resurrection. We are talking about Jesus's teachings. We are talking about the whole realm of what took place and why we are here where we are, and trying to enhance our spirituality and our belief, and making it here and now, being with God here and now. And I have really changed from the old way to, I can see God's kingdom now through things like we're doing today, through friendships, through just being with one another, which we have a hard time right now doing. But, this to me is the kingdom of God right now.
Yeah.
And I really liked how he brought in the past scripture that the stones that the masons threw away will become the cornerstones that could be. And Jesus definitely is a cornerstone to our beliefs, to our spirituality. And I can even imagine that Muhammad is also a cornerstone, and so is Buddha. They believe in the same God. Maybe they have some different ways of doing things, but they're probably still cornerstones. And even though Mark didn't know about them, I guess, maybe he did, I don't know. But they are cornerstones to people who are following them. So anyway, it's just kind of this broad thing that we are all under one God, not a bunch of different gods.
Well, certainly the approach from Mark is a more universal approach to God, that is not just the God of the Jews, it's the God of all nations. And while we will certainly, as we go into reflection on this in our own ways, it'll blossom like yours just did. But what is clear from Mark is that resurrection was not something that happened on a singularity, but resurrection happens. And if that's what you named too, I think that's what Marilyn named in her expression of her spiritual journey over her life. I think each one of you could name how resurrection has been real, has happened within you. As you've moved through the places of fear with faith, that's resurrection. As you have refused to give in to cynicism and hatred and violence and moved instead with compassion and forgiveness and love, that is the fruitful work of resurrection. Do you see? It's not about trying to identify every single way that resurrection happens, but to know that it happens and then be open to receiving it and seeing it and being it. And this whole idea of eternity is not something that happens later. Eternity happens now. It's always now, which of course is later too. But if now exists, then there is no later. So it's only now. So it's that idea that Mark is playing with or trying to communicate to us to help us see that it's not about a resurrection event in the future and going up to the kingdom to see our family. Or I should say this, that classic way that you named it, Boyce, that beautiful way, because that's what a lot of us want, that sense of reunification with those that we love. It may be like that, but the point of Mark is, whatever it is, it starts now. We create the kingdom of God now. We participate in that creation now. We tend the vineyard now. So that is where Mark's focus is, not on some future event. And I think as we go into it, as Boyce said, as we really reflect on this stuff, that really does deepen our appreciation of what faith means, of what resurrection looks like, of what, walking with Jesus means. Okay. Any other questions or comments about that?
Thank you for that, Dan. That came home to me, what you just said.
Wonderful, Annie. And that's me, what we're hoping to create here is that sense that this is bringing us to a deeper appreciation and understanding of what it means to be home, to embody home, to embody that place where we are are free to be our deepest selves. That's home. And then when we discover what that is, we want to create a world that is more home-like for others. But we have to be able to kind of reflect on it in this way to kind of just see where maybe we had been, or maybe we embody some of those soils that block us from really appreciating, some of the other ways, the deeper ways to live this message. Mark's concern is that we see it, that we receive it, and that we have the opportunity to live it, to be fruitful, despite the fact that the world is what it is, and that many groups in the world reject, and that violence is a way of the world. All that stuff, we know this to be true. It's not changed. But what can change? Here. Okay. The scribe that comes up to Jesus in verses 28 to 34. It's a really interesting encounter. And, when he kind of comes up and he asks him the question, right? What's the most important commandment? And they have this conversation. In that conversation, in those verses, what's your impression of that scribe? Is it positive or is it negative, or, just in general? Jay?
Well, it seems to be positive that he was asking him something about uplifting and he agreed with it.
Yeah. It seems to be, maybe for the first time, maybe not the first time, but the first time in a long time, where one of the religious leaders, or a scribe, approaches Jesus with just a question. And then they engage the question, and we're left with a very favorable opinion of him, because Jesus himself gives us this favorable opinion of him. But there's an interesting dynamic that is revealed in terms of authority here. And I hope you noticed it, because it's just brilliant. So the scribe listens to what Jesus says, and Jesus' response actually goes well beyond the bounds of the question. You'll notice that. The scribe asks him, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus gives him 2. That's okay. I mean, that's something for us to chew on. And I think what he's doing is he's recognizing that you can't have one of those without the other. That the way we love God is by loving our neighbor. So I think that's what Jesus is doing there. Even though he gives him 2 commandments, but regardless, those are the ones. What we see is the scribe agrees with him. And in that agreement, what he's doing is he's sort of giving his seal of approval, right? The scribe is a legal expert, an expert in the law, an expert in all the commandments. He knows all 636 or whatever there are. But the scribe says to him, yes, you are right. You're very wise, Jesus. It's like this, he's sort of asserting his authority over Jesus in that moment. And it's given. It's given. But then who gets the last word? Jesus gets the last word. And it's a brilliant way of saying, it ain't just about understanding the law. But hey, scribe, good. You're on the right path. You're not far from the kingdom of God. Okay, Jesus, the scribes demonstrating mastery over a very small realm, the realm of law, and Jesus is given a mastery and an authority over much larger. And so that little interaction just illustrates so beautifully and succinctly the way that Jesus' authority is even above that of the law. Okay, so his mastery is military, his mastery is political, his mastery is religious, his mastery is legal. Okay, he's given that. That's part of the inheritance there. But it's a beautiful interaction, and it is positive. And we need to pay attention to that because the scribes have not gotten a lot of positive press in Mark's gospel, but this one has. And it illustrates something that we've talked about, and that is it's possible to overcome your type. You know, we're not necessarily bound there. Now, some people, they don't get out. They are so hard that they can't see. That's true, but it's not a fait accompli. Okay, it is not predestined. This scribe is capable. Now, we're not told whether or not he does, right? We're not told that he goes out and he becomes a follower like Bartimaeus, or he goes out and he starts preaching the gospel or bearing fruit in other ways, like some of the other humble servants who were healed, those people. But he's given a chance, and that's all that matters. He's got a chance. Being a scribe does not mean he's just thrown out. That's important. That's important. Comments or questions about that? Okay. So then we got two more little sections here, and that is that verses 35 to 37 is a reference to David and all that stuff. Okay. What's that trying to tell us? What's that all about? It's a reiteration. Okay. It's a reiteration of some of the stuff we've said. But what is that really trying to tell us? Is that a hand, Jay? Okay, yeah.
Don't confuse me with being the son of David. I'm the son of God.
Amen.
How can I be the son of David when David refers to God?
In a world who expected the Messiah King to be an heir of David, Jesus is breaking that wide open. Mark is breaking that wide open. The Christ is not David's heir. The Christ is God's heir, way bigger than David, way more universal than David. This isn't about military, political victory. It's about way more than that. That little, confusing set of verses, somewhat confusing, is really simply trying to illustrate that Jesus, as the heir of the vineyard, is not David's heir, but God's heir. Okay? Much bigger appreciation than what was expected of this heir. Again, the world was expecting the heir of David, the heir of the Davidic line, to be the Messiah. Yeah, much bigger than that. Much bigger. Again, he's partly that. He is that. He's just way more than that. Lastly, we got two teachings. So we have three controversy stories followed by three teachings. The first teaching is that David thing about the nature of his being the heir. There's two last teachings here at the end of the chapter, verses 38 to 44. And I just want to say, without going necessarily into total detail here, but is it surprising to you the way who illustrates what should be done and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, or who illustrates being unfruitful soil versus fruitful soil? Is it surprising how that plays out? No, it isn't, is it? They're playing their types again. We're back in the role of the scribes being the hard-hearted, fuddy-duddies, and the one who demonstrates the true powerful faith, the good soil, is the widow, the one with nothing, the one who doesn't have social, political advantage or power, who has no economic power, who has no social status as a widow, who relies on the protection of others for every single thing that she gets. She is as low as it gets on the totem pole. She is elevated because the opportunity to be good soil has nothing to do with economic advantage or political advantage or social advantage. See, that's the illustration. And there's something else that's brought up in this. We've seen that the scribes, we just got that one good example of the one scribe, but now the group of scribes is being all, back in their old role again. And it kind of brings up a pattern that we see a lot in Mark. And that is that in many ways, the ones who are healed, the ones who are good soil are individuals who emerge out of the crowds. The ones who are healed kind of step out, like we were talking about in the beginning, and they take a risk for the sake of faith. They step out of the crowd. And most often the ones who resist and oppose are the crowds or the groups, right? This is how that's the pattern that's been. Mark is emphasizing something by using so many examples like that. What do you think he's emphasizing there? What has the capacity to save us or to bring us to a deeper, more fruitful faith? The groups we're a part of? Barbara?
Well, I think we have to do the work, the practice ourselves in our hearts.
That's it. It's up to us. The soil is possible within each one of us, but not by our participation in a particular group will that make the decision for us. And in fact, locking ourselves in alignment with groups in the Gospel of Mark, more often than not, is a means of opposition or confusion or missing the point. It's stepping out of those groups. Jane?
Dan?
Yeah.
What it brought to mind for me, is that the church, the faith group that we are affiliated with is not what makes the kingdom on earth be fruitful within us.
Amen.
I had my paternal grandmother became a Jehovah's Witness and was convinced our family was going to hell because we weren't Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. And we've seen, sadly, too much of that over the centuries of faith groups believing that their way is the only way. And it's really our own hearts. And I would just go back to God knows my heart. God knows my heart. And that is my relationship to God and how I can be fruitful. And it's not, just because you belong to a certain church doesn't mean you've got it all going for you.
Exactly. And more often than not, being affiliated with groups can work against our own sort of liberation, our own growth. Now, that's not to say all groups, because we know that some groups are very nourishing, but the pattern that Mark illustrates here is that it's within the individual to make that move towards faith, to take that risk, because ultimately we do have to take a risk. We do have to make a choice. It's not just by affiliation. It's not just by bloodlines. It's not just by the larger, being a part of a class, an economic or social class of people. Yeah, none of that is relevant. So that move is something that's very profound. And that's one of the things I love about the Gospel of Mark. Jesus did not come to start a new religion. Jesus came to show people how to live, how to be alive in God and in faith. And that's where the kingdom of God is. It has nothing to do with religious identity and creed and belief system and law. None of that is ultimate. Look, it's not that it has to be thrown out, but if it's getting in the way, throw it out. And it's getting in the way when it creates within us a righteousness that says you're wrong and I'm right. That's getting in the way. We've seen examples like that throughout the gospel of Jesus, of encountering people like that. And he continually tries to correct even his own disciples. No, look, they are with us. Let them do what they do. If it's creating fruitful response, then that's the kingdom of God. But it's not about our group affiliation. And again, we have created it in our image for religion. And it's not to say that it's to be thrown out completely. Of course not. It's still valuable. It's still meaningful. We're creating sacred community. But I think staying humble within our communities and recognizing how imperfect they all are will help serve us in maybe moving more intentionally and deeply and compassionately into the way we follow Jesus. Questions or comments about that? Bertie.
The widow does nothing to try and make herself stand out, but God's saying, I see what's in your heart.
Yes. Yes. And notice the ones who try to make themselves stand out constantly through the Gospels are the disciples. Or what was it? Who were the ones, the scribes? Yeah, the scribes that walk around in their fine robes and like to be seen praying. No, the ones that draw attention to themselves, that itself is an illustration of poor soil. Because all the ones who were healed just simply and silently and humbly go forth and be fruitful. That's it. That's it. God sees it. That's enough. Now, that is hard in a society that is often about trying to be seen and heard and recognized and validated. Again, none of which is bad. We all come from different stories. Sometimes it's important for us to be able to stand up and claim our power in this world. That validation is important, and we all need it in different ways. But what Mark is saying is that ultimately, it's that humble, quiet service to neighbor and thereby to God that our faith and our fruit is born and best shown. Not about calling attention to ourselves. Ultimately, again, not if we call attention to ourselves for something, doesn't mean, oh God, we've missed it completely. We're off the reservation or whatever. We're off the ship of toward glory. No. Just about seeing clearly that that's not what it's about ultimately, and then refocusing ourselves onto that other path.
I find this group to be one of those that you call a nourishing group.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Me too. I hope so. I hope it is, and because we engage each other with honesty and openness, but ultimately we each decide what that means, and how it lands in us, how it will where we go from here, kind of thing. And where we go from here in Mark's gospel is that increasingly we see these groups of people aligned against Jesus, and his circle of friends and circle of good soil gets smaller and smaller to where he is basically becomes an individual. And his walk of faith gets incredibly difficult. Okay, a walk of faith that we understand. We know how difficult it is to walk in the ways we've been talking about. But ultimately, he makes the decisions too. He's deciding to walk in this way in the face of the fear and the doubt and the violence. He has his questions. He has his moments. But ultimately, he keeps going. And so Mark is using the illustration of Jesus through the Passion story, again, through the chapters we're about to see, as a way of demonstrating that the good soil is motivated from within the heart of each one of us. And our capacity to follow that faith, even in the face of all those challenges, all that fear and doubt and violence and whatever else, that's what's required of the good soil. But Jesus shows us how to go through those things well. With the sense that our pain in this world, our suffering in this world is not the final word. But after this life and in this life, we will experience a deep sense of connection to God when we give ourselves to this way and connection to one another. And that will not die when we die. That will continue in a present tense way with God. So there's nothing to fear. So what's stopping us? I think that's one of Mark's questions too. What's stopping me? All right. Anything else? Anyone want to add something? Reflections or just kind of something to lighten it up? I don't know. Not that it needs to be. Marilyn.
I'll talk fast, I promise. There's a little bit more to my story that I feel like I want to say because I'm feeling kind of vulnerable right at the moment. I still am a practicing Buddhist, and I still study and take to heart the Tao, I didn't give those things up.
Mhm.
I just expanded in such a way that it fit me well. And so when people ask me if I'm a Christian, I have to say, well, actually, I'm a Taoist, Buddhist, Jewish Christian. And that's what means the most to me. It doesn't mean that I expect anybody else to come up with the same kind of way of responding and looking to it all, but somehow it helps me to be able to have a wonderful spiritual life and to reach out to other people.
Yeah. And I think that's beautiful, because what is asked of us, Jesus never asks before healing anyone, or, when people don't receive healing based on what their identification is within a certain religion or any kind of group. But really what it comes down to is it's those who are willing to risk loving they're loving God fully and loving neighbor fully. That's where we find our healing and our wholeness. And so that move of identification and practice is really what Mark is challenging us with, because so many people want to approach this as being, well, if I believe the right things, if I'm part of the right group, if I have the right understanding, then I'm there. And it's just not so.
No.
It's more than that. It's richer than that, and it's harder than that. And so that's what we're being presented. But ultimately, it is so worth it. It is so worth it, because it's the freedom of the human spirit. It's the relation with one another. It's the connection, the unification with God that is at stake. And so as we try to step into this, whether through this group or on our own individual lives, that's what we're practicing. So keep on, friends. You're doing it. Stay on the path, stay with the questions, stay with all the things that come before you.
Get down.
Recognize, that you're in good company, with this group and with all who have gone before. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all again. And we'll see you next week for session 13. We'll be reading Mark chapter 13. So I look forward to seeing you then. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.